She had only 2% battery and a single chance, but she texted the wrong number. Instead of the police, instead of friends, the message, "They're going to kill me," fell into the hands of Chicago's most dangerous man. And 5 minutes later, black SUVs ripped through the night, gunfire echoed through the parking lot, and a man in a black cloak walked through the smoke like the Grim Reaper. This is the story of Evelyn Vale, the girl who survived thanks to a typo. Watch until the end to find out what really happened. Like and comment the city you're watching in so I know how far my story has come. The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight and showed no sign of stopping. Room 214 of the Lakeview Motor Inn smelled like mildew and old cigarette smoke, the kind of smell that soaked into the walls over decades and never came out no matter how many times the management replaced the bedspreads. The single lamp on the nightstand threw a dim yellow ring across the carpet, stained brown near the bathroom door, darker near the window. And outside, the neon vacancy sign buzzed and flickered like it was struggling to stay alive. Evelyn Vale was struggling to stay alive too. She sat with her back pressed against the far wall, knees pulled to her chest, the cheap industrial carpet rough against her bare feet. She'd lost one shoe somewhere between the parking lot and the stairwell when she ran. The other one lay kicked beneath the bed, pointless now. Her hands were shaking. Not the small trembling of cold, but the deep structural shaking that started somewhere in the chest and radiated outward, the kind that made it impossible to hold anything steady. The flash drive was still in her bra. That fact alone was the only thing keeping her from completely falling apart. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum, felt the small, hard rectangle of plastic through the fabric, and told herself, "It's still there. You still have it. You're still breathing." Outside the room, somewhere below, she could hear them moving. 2 voices. Maybe 3. One of them she recognized as Garrett, Nolan's man, the one who always stood by the door at their apartment building, the one she'd smiled at 100 times while carrying in groceries, who'd nodded and said evening, Ms. Vale, like a normal human being. She'd thought he was a doorman. She'd thought a lot of things. She went up. East stairwell. Check the rooms. Start from the top. The top was the 3rd floor. She was on the 2nd. That gave her maybe 4 minutes, probably less. Her phone screen read 2%. Evelyn pulled up her contacts with fingers that didn't want to cooperate. The screen blurred and she blinked hard, forced herself to focus. She needed the police. She needed to dial 911 and explain everything clearly and calmly, and her stomach dropped. Nolan had told her once in a voice that was almost bored with itself that he had people inside CPD, not 1 or 2. Several. He'd said it to impress her, back when she was still trying to convince herself that the man she lived with was complicated but not dangerous, interesting but not evil. He'd said it the way someone talks about a good investment portfolio. She'd laughed nervously and changed the subject. Now she was trapped in a motel room on the south side of Chicago with blood drying on her knuckles, and the evidence of his crimes pressing against her ribcage, and every name in her phone felt like a liability. Her college roommate was 3 states away and would never pick up a number she didn't recognize. Her mother was in Phoenix and would panic and make everything worse. Her friend Dana worked at the same financial firm as Nolan. She'd realized that 2 weeks ago, the sick, slow realization that Dana had been watching her the whole time, feeding information back. There was no one. The footsteps in the hallway got louder. Evelyn pressed herself harder against the wall and did the only thing she could think of. She went to her contacts and scrolled to the emergency number, the number Nolan had given her 8 months ago when she'd first moved in with him, pressing a folded piece of paper into her palm like it was something precious. If anything ever happens, if there's a fire, if someone breaks in, anything. He'd been so careful, so controlled when he said it. You call this number, not 911. This number. They'll handle it. She'd memorized it the way Nolan wanted because Nolan always wanted things memorized rather than written down. She'd never questioned what handle it actually meant. Her thumbs moved across the keyboard. Help. They are going to kill me. Room 214, Lakeview Motor Inn, South Halstead. She stared at the message for half a second. The phone was at 2%. If she waited too long, the battery would die and the message would never send at all. She hit the button. Delivered. The lamp flickered and died. Evelyn sat in darkness, listening to the rain beat against the window and the footsteps move methodically down the hallway, door to door. She heard someone try the knob of 216, then 215. A pause. She stopped breathing entirely. The knob of 214 turned. The lock held. She'd thrown the deadbolt when she came in, some muscle memory instinct from 1,000 nights in apartments she'd double-locked out of habit. But deadbolts on motel room doors weren't built for serious intent. She heard the man on the other side apply pressure. The frame groaned. Her phone buzzed. One message. Unknown number. Stay alive for 5 minutes. Evelyn read it twice in the dark, with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She didn't have time to process what it meant, or who had sent it, or why the number she'd been given as a personal security line apparently belonged to someone who responded to distress texts with 5-word commands instead of reassurance. Then the night outside exploded. She heard the vehicles before she saw them. The deep engine growl of something heavy moving fast, the screech of tires on wet asphalt, the sudden hard brightness of headlights pouring through the rain-streaked window. 3 vehicles. Maybe 4. She pressed herself below the windowsill and risked a glance over the ledge. Black SUVs had cut off every exit from the parking lot. Men in dark clothing were moving across the wet asphalt with a kind of organized silence that had nothing casual about it. She counted 6 in the time it took her to exhale. Then another 3 emerging from the stairwell entrance at the far end of the building. One of Nolan's men shouted something. The first shot came from the ground level. Everything after that happened in layers. Gunfire and the sound of running and something heavy falling down the stairwell. A car alarm triggered by a stray impact. The distant wail of sirens that probably wouldn't arrive in time to matter. Evelyn stayed below the window with her hands clamped over her ears and tried to remember what breathing felt like. The footsteps that had been working toward her door reversed direction fast. Then heavy boots on the stairs. Not retreating, advancing. Coming up, not down. A single set of footsteps that moved with complete unhurried certainty through everything happening below, the way a man moves when the chaos around him belongs to him entirely. The door of 214 opened, not forced. The deadbolt simply ceased to be an obstacle. She heard the brief mechanical sound of something being applied to the lock, and then the door swung inward, and cold air and the smell of rain and gunpowder came in with it. The man who stood in the doorway wasn't running, wasn't breathless. He had a pistol held low in his right hand, and he scanned the room once, the bathroom, the corner, the space behind the door, before his eyes settled on Evelyn pressed against the far wall with her knees pulled to her chest and blood on her hands. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at her wrists. The bruising there was fresh, purple-black in the dim light spilling in from the hallway. Nolan had grabbed her hard when he caught her at the laptop. She'd wrenched free. The marks were a catalog of exactly how that had gone. Something moved behind the man's eyes. Not softness, exactly. Something harder than softness, but adjacent to it, the way iron gets when it's been held near flame long enough. "Who touched you?" he said. His voice was quiet. That was the most frightening thing about it. Men who shouted were manageable, understandable. This man's voice was the kind of quiet that didn't need volume to land with full weight. Evelyn's mouth opened. Nothing came out. He crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched to her level, which put him closer than she wanted him to be, but somehow removed the towering aspect of him, made him slightly less like something that had just walked out of the worst night of her life. Up close, she could see water dripping from the hem of his overcoat, could see the clean, precise line of his jaw, and the unhurried quality of his breathing, the breathing of someone who had been in rooms like this before. "Evelyn Vale," he said. Not a question. "How do you know my Nolan Mercer's girlfriend? You took something from him." He studied her face. "You still have it." It wasn't a question either. Evelyn's hand moved involuntarily toward her chest, and she caught herself, but not fast enough. His expression didn't change. "I'm not here for the drive," he said. "Then what are you here for?" "You texted that number," he said simply. "That's sufficient." Downstairs, the gunfire had stopped. The silence that replaced it was not peaceful. It was the silence of aftermath, of things settled by force, and it pressed against the walls of the room from outside. Evelyn looked at the man kneeling in front of her. She looked at the gun still in his hand. She looked at the complete absence of hesitation in his face and understood, with the clarity that only comes when the brain has run out of room for self-deception, that she had no idea what she had just put in motion. "Can you walk?" he asked. Her shoulder was cramped from being pressed against the wall. Her feet were bare. Her hands were still shaking. "Yes," she said. He stood and held out his free hand. Evelyn stared at it. "There are approximately 90 seconds before this location draws attention we don't want," he said. "Decide." She took his hand. His grip was firm and dry and completely steady, and she hated how much that mattered to her in that moment, the steadiness of it, the sense that whatever had just happened downstairs was under control in a way that nothing in her life had been for months. He moved her quickly through the hallway, past doors that had been opened and not reclosed, past a man lying on the floor who she forced herself not to look at directly, and down the west stairwell into the rain-soaked night. A black vehicle was already running at the curb, a man behind the wheel who didn't turn around, who pulled away from the motel before Evelyn had fully gotten the door shut. Nobody spoke. Evelyn watched the motel recede in the rear-view mirror, the neon sign, the rain, the two black SUVs still parked at angles across the lot. Then she turned and looked at the man sitting beside her. "Who are you?" she asked. He looked out the window. Damien Moretti. She knew the name. Not well, not specifically, but the way you know a weather pattern. You recognize the shape of it on the horizon without needing a meteorologist to explain it. Nolan had said the name exactly once, in passing, in a conversation about a business arrangement that had gone sideways, and the way he'd said it, low, careful, controlled, had made Evelyn look up from her book and then decide she didn't want to know. Now she knew. "You're—" she started. "Yes," he said. The city moved past the windows in wet streaks of light. Evelyn pressed her back against the car door and tried to figure out which part of her situation had just gotten better and which part had gotten catastrophically worse, and arrived at the uncomfortable conclusion that she couldn't separate the two. The penthouse was on the 42nd floor of a building in the Gold Coast that she recognized from the outside as one of those addresses that appeared in architecture magazines. Inside, it was not what she expected. She had formed a rapid, unconscious picture based on everything she half knew about men like Damien Moretti. Ostentatious, heavy, designed to display power the way a zoo displays animals. What she found instead was spare, clean lines. A view of the city through floor-to-ceiling glass that made the skyline look like something you could reach out and rearrange. The furniture was good, but not excessive. The books on the shelves were real, read, spine-cracked, annotated from what she could see. Nothing was trying to prove anything. A man with a medical bag appeared from an adjacent room and moved toward her without introduction. Evelyn took an instinctive step back. "He's going to look at your hands and wrists," Damien said from behind her. "That's all." "I'm fine." "You have a 2-inch laceration on your left palm you haven't noticed yet." She looked down. He was right. The adrenaline had been covering it completely. There was a clean cut from where she'd grabbed the edge of the laptop screen when Nolan yanked it from her, when this had all started, 4 hours ago, a lifetime ago. The blood had dried dark against her skin. She let the man with the medical bag work. Damien stood by the windows with his back to her, looking out at the rain-blurred city, and she watched his reflection in the glass. He was still in his coat, still holding the pistol, though it was now holstered somewhere she couldn't see. His shoulders were very straight. When the man with the medical bag finished and left, Damien turned and set a mug on the coffee table in front of her. Tea. Evelyn looked at it. She looked at him. "You're surprised," he said. "Little bit." He sat down in the chair across from her, not close, the full width of the coffee table between them. "The drive," he said. "What's on it?" "You don't know?" "I have an idea. I want to hear yours." She wrapped her bandaged hands around the mug because it was warm and she was cold all the way through. "Financial records," she said. "Mercer's accounts, the shell companies, the routing sequences. And something else." She paused. "Communications between Mercer and a man named Cortez." Damien's expression didn't change, but something in the room did. A subtle pressurization, like a shift in altitude. How long have you had the drive? 3 days. I found it by accident. He'd left his laptop open and I wasn't looking for anything. She stopped. I copied the files and he caught me before I could get out. Damien looked at her steadily. Did you read what the communications said? Some of it. Tell me. Cortez was arranging something, Evelyn said. Something at the Harrington negotiation. Mercer was helping him with logistics, money, access, timing. She met his eyes. Your name was in 3 of them. The silence that followed had a different texture than the silences before it. You understand what those files mean, he said. It was not a question. I understand it's why he wanted me dead, she said. Damien leaned back slightly and looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully classify. Not warmth exactly. Something more like the recognition of a weight. The specific weight of a person who had stumbled into a situation far beyond their own gravity and was still, against all reasonable expectation, holding themselves together. You should sleep, he said. I'm not going to sleep. Then sit here until you're ready to. He stood. Nobody enters this floor without my approval. You're safe. You keep saying that. Because it's true. Evelyn looked at her bandaged hands. She looked at the mug of tea. She looked at the rain against the glass and the city lights smearing in the wet, and thought about the motel room, and Nolan's voice, and Garrett saying she's still here, and something in her chest cracked open along a seam she hadn't known was there. Why? She asked. Why bring me here? You don't know me. Damien stopped by the doorway. The number you called, he said. It's been the same number for 11 years. I gave it to exactly 4 people. A pause. Mercer was not one of them. Evelyn frowned. Then how did he— That, Damien said, his voice dropping into something flat and very cold, is exactly the question I intend to answer. He left her there with the tea going warm in her hands, and the city spread out below her like evidence of something she didn't yet have the language to name. She didn't sleep, but she sat there until the shaking stopped, and in the quiet of the 42nd floor, with armed men somewhere below, and rain streaking the glass and Damien Moretti's voice still carrying its quiet weight through the room, the shaking did, eventually, stop. That was the first night. The second day brought a different kind of dread. Not the immediate physical terror of being hunted, that had been replaced by a cold, sustained unease, the unease of a person who had been moved from one cage to another without yet knowing if the new cage was better or simply larger. Evelyn walked the penthouse in the morning while Damien was in a meeting somewhere on the floor below, tracing the perimeter of her situation the way you trace the walls of a dark room. She found the kitchen and made herself coffee with shaking hands that were steadier than the night before. She found a room that appeared to be a study. Books, a desk, 2 phones charging side by side, a framed photograph turned face down on the shelf. She didn't touch it. She found the man named Russo standing outside her door when she returned to her room, which she had not been given but which had been designated by Damien with a brief, "Your room is the 3rd on the left," the night before. "I'm not a prisoner," she said to Russo. "No, ma'am," he said. "Then why are you standing there?" "Because someone might try to make you one," he said, with the particular frankness of a man who has decided honesty is easier than pretense. "And I'd rather that didn't happen." Evelyn considered that for a moment. "Fair enough," she said, and went back inside. By the afternoon of the second day, she had begun to build a picture from fragments, from overheard conversations through walls, from the controlled urgency in the voices of the men who came and went, from the single exchange she caught when she walked past an open door and heard Damien say the Harrington meeting cannot move, and someone else say Cortez won't wait, and Damien say, then Cortez is going to be disappointed. By the 3rd day, she understood most of it. The flash drive she'd stolen from Nolan Mercer did not simply contain evidence of money laundering. It contained the operational blueprint for an assassination attempt against Damien at an upcoming peace negotiation. The Harrington Summit, brokered over 6 months between 3 competing organizations that had spent 2 years bleeding each other across the south and west sides. Mercer had been feeding logistics to a cartel faction operating under a man called Cortez, who had no interest in peace and every interest in eliminating the one figure capable of enforcing it. Evelyn had walked into that apartment, opened a laptop left carelessly open, and stumbled into the center of a war that had been building for 2 years. She told Damien this analysis over dinner on the third evening, told him flatly, without performance, because she had a business degree and 3 years of auditing experience, and she'd read every file on that drive twice before Nolan caught her. And the architecture of what Mercer had built was not particularly complex if you knew what shell company structures looked like from the inside. Damien listened without interrupting. "You know what you're describing," he said when she finished. "That you were supposed to die at the Harrington meeting." "Yes." "And that Mercer has been inside my organization for long enough to have the number." 11 years, you said?" She met his gaze. "Which means whoever gave him that number has been compromised for a long time." Damien was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a controlled precision that she was beginning to understand was the outer boundary of what he let show. "Yes." Evelyn set down her fork. "What happens now?" "I find out who gave him the number," he said, "and I shut down the Harrington operation before Cortez can move." "And me." He looked at her across the table. The light from the pendant lamp above them caught the angles of his face and made him look older than he probably was, the specific aging that came from carrying too much for too long. "You stay here," he said. "I'm not because I'm keeping you," he said, "because Mercer still wants you dead. The drive is evidence. You're a witness. Until Cortez is neutralized and Mercer is handled, walking out of this building is the same as putting a gun in your own mouth." A pause. His voice didn't soften exactly, but the edge came off it by a degree. "So you stay here, until it's over." Evelyn looked at her plate. She looked at the city through the glass. She thought about her apartment, the lease probably already canceled, the things still inside it, the version of her life that had existed 5 days ago and was simply gone now, like a door that closed and stopped being a door. "Okay," she said. Damien nodded once. They ate in silence after that, but it was not an unfriendly silence. It was the silence of two people recalibrating around each other, sorting out the terms of a proximity neither of them had chosen. Outside, the city moved and breathed and kept its 1,000 separate secrets, and somewhere in it Nolan Mercer was still breathing too, and regrouping and making new plans. That was the thing about men like Nolan, Evelyn had come to understand. They didn't run when they were cornered. They pivoted. They found new angles. They were at their most dangerous, not when they were winning, but when they had nothing left to lose. She lay awake that night listening to the rain that had started again. Chicago in November was nothing but rain and cold, and the grim specific weight of a Midwestern winter setting in, and stared at the ceiling and thought, "He's coming." Not if, when. The thought didn't calm her, but it organized her, and in the absence of safety, organization was the closest thing available. She pressed her palm against the flash drive, still there, still hard and real through the fabric of the borrowed shirt someone had left for her. She was still breathing. For now, that was enough. 4 days after the motel, a name surfaced. Damien delivered it to her without preamble on a Tuesday morning, standing in the kitchen doorway with a coffee cup in his hand and the kind of expression she was learning to read. The controlled version, the version that showed nothing, which paradoxically told her more than any unguarded face would have. "His contact inside the building," Damien said. "The one who gave Mercer the number." Evelyn waited. "Luca," he said. "My second." The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Evelyn had met Luca twice in 4 days. Once in passing, once during a brief meeting she'd been asked to attend because her knowledge of the drive's contents was operationally relevant. He'd been professional, careful. He'd addressed her with a neutral courtesy that she'd taken for the guarded cordiality of a man uncertain how to categorize her. She thought of Garrett, the doorman, and how she'd smiled at him for 2 years. "What will you do?" she said. Damien's jaw tightened by a fraction. "Handle it." "Damien, don't," he said, and the word was quiet but final, the kind of word that closed doors. He looked at her for a moment, and something crossed his face that wasn't cold at all, that was in fact almost unbearably human. the look of a man who had just learned that the person standing closest to him for 11 years had been holding a knife the whole time. He left the kitchen. Evelyn stood in the silence he'd left behind and felt, for the first time since the motel, something other than fear. She felt the specific ache of watching someone hurt and being unable to reach them. That realization unsettled her more than anything else had, because she understood, somewhere clear and uncomfortably honest, that whatever Damien Moretti was, and she was not naive about what he was, she had started to see him. Not the myth, not the name, not the controlled exterior. The man who sat alone after midnight. The man who had a photograph turned face down on his shelf. The man who asked about her hands before he asked about the drive. She was still thinking about it an hour later when Russo knocked on her door and said quietly, "You should probably know. Luca's been removed from the building." Evelyn nodded. "Mr. Moretti asked me to tell you," Russo added, "that the number has been changed." She understood what that meant. It meant the breach was sealed. It meant Damien had done what needed doing and was telling her she was safer now, and he'd chosen to tell her through Russo because telling her directly would have required a different kind of acknowledgement than he was ready to make. Evelyn pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window. Below, the city went about its business in the gray November light. And somewhere out there, Nolan Mercer was pivoting. She could feel it. The photograph had been turned face down for a reason. Evelyn found that out on the 5th morning, not because Damien told her, but because she was standing in the hallway outside the study when the door swung open and he walked out carrying it, the frame, glass side up now. And the image was visible for exactly 2 seconds before he registered her presence, and his expression closed like a shutter dropping. A woman, dark hair, young, standing in front of a lake somewhere with the particular relaxed quality of someone who doesn't know the picture is being taken. "Sorry," Evelyn said. "I wasn't—" "It's fine," he said, and went back inside and closed the door. It was not fine. The word had the texture of something placed in front of a gap to stop drafts. Functional, minimal, designed to prevent further entry. Evelyn went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter and drank her coffee and thought about the photograph and thought about the particular way Damien's shoulders had set when he saw her standing there and decided she was going to leave it alone for at least another day. She lasted about 4 hours. It was Russo who told her, not willingly. Russo had the instinctive discretion of a man who had kept secrets professionally for a long time, but he also had a quality she'd noticed in the first days, a kind of careful sympathy that operated underneath his professional surface. And when she asked him directly who the woman in the photograph was, he looked at the wall for a moment and then said quietly, "His sister, Bianca." "Where is she?" "Here, elsewhere. She moves." He paused. "Mr. Moretti keeps her away from operational matters. She's not in the life. He worked hard to keep her out of it." Evelyn thought about that. Does she know what he does? Russo looked at her with an expression that said, "That's not my question to answer." "Right," she said. She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. The specific labor of loving someone by keeping them at a distance. The way care could look indistinguishable from coldness when it was working. She'd seen it in the turned-down photograph. She saw it in the way Damien moved through his own apartment, efficient and contained, never lingering in any room long enough to seem like he lived there, as if inhabiting his own life too fully might make it a liability. At 6 that evening, he came into the kitchen while she was eating and sat down across from her without ceremony and said, "I need to know everything you remember from the Cortez communications. Dates, language, names." Evelyn set down her fork. "Okay," she said. "All of it. Not the summary, the details." "I know what you said." He looked at her steadily. She looked back at him with equal steadiness and said, "You want to do this now, or do you want to get a pen?" Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The structural suggestion of one. "I'll get a pen," he said. They worked for 2 hours at the kitchen table. Evelyn went through every file she'd read on the drive with the methodical precision she'd learned doing forensic audits. Not storytelling, not interpretation, just the clean sequential recall of dates and account numbers, and the specific language used in communications that sounded innocuous on the surface and were not innocuous at all. Damien wrote and occasionally asked questions that were so targeted and specific they told her as much about his operational knowledge as her answers told him about the drive. He knew Cortez's organizational structure. He knew the shell company names. He was filling in timing, the when and the how, with what she remembered. At some point the hour got late, and neither of them mentioned it. "This line," Damien said, tapping his pen against the notepad. "You said Mercer used the phrase technical access to the east entrance. That's specific." "Yes. The Harrington Building's east entrance is the service corridor. It's not on any public schematic." Evelyn looked at him. "Which means Mercer had internal information. Which means someone inside the Harrington organization is also compromised." He set the pen down. His jaw was tight. Not just Luca. The quiet that followed had a different quality than the comfortable working silences of the past 2 hours. This one had teeth. "How many people knew about Harrington?" Evelyn said. "Enough," he said, which meant too many, which meant the radius of the problem was larger than he'd calculated, and she could see him recalculating in real time, the controlled, rapid motion of a mind sorting through a structure that was bigger and more compromised than he'd let himself believe until now. "You can't trust the meeting anymore?" she said. "I can't cancel it either. Cortez wants me to cancel it. It would look like retreat." He looked at the notes in front of him. "I need to find the inside contact at Harrington before the summit date. That's 10 days. "How?" "Carefully." He glanced up at her. "Get some sleep." "You're not." "No." "Then I don't see why—" "Evelyn." The way he said it, not sharp, not dismissive, but with a weight that was almost personal, the weight of someone who needed her to not be present for the next several hours, because her presence was making certain necessary distances difficult to maintain. She understood that without being told. She understood it and felt it resonate somewhere inconvenient. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the apartment and heard, very faintly through walls and floors, the low sustained activity of men working through the night. Phones, footsteps, once a raised voice that was cut off quickly. And thought about 10 days and Cortez and the east entrance, and the specific image of Damien at the kitchen table with a pen in his hand and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and that fractional almost smile when she'd said get a pen. Sleep, when it came, was thin and full of motel hallways. She woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of something hitting the floor in the adjacent room. Not violent. A thud, then silence, then nothing. Evelyn lay still for a moment. Russo was outside her door, she knew. Whatever it was not a threat. She closed her eyes and tried to go back under and couldn't. She got up. The hallway was quiet. Russo nodded at her from his post. Alert, unsurprised, the look of a man accustomed to people being awake at hours they shouldn't be. She moved toward the kitchen and stopped in the doorway. Damien was standing at the counter with a glass of water and a cut across the back of his right hand that was bleeding steadily onto the marble. He was looking at it with a focused, abstracted expression, the expression of a man trying to remember how to care about something minor. There was a broken glass on the floor 3 feet away. "You should put something on that," Evelyn said. He looked up. No surprise. "It's fine. You keep using that word." He looked back at his hand. Evelyn went to the cabinet under the sink. She'd found the first aid kit on day 2 and pulled it out and set it on the counter and opened it. She unrolled gauze and tore it at the right length with her teeth, and he watched her do all of this without protest and without moving away, which she took as permission. She took his hand. He let her. The cut wasn't deep, but it had gapped open and needed pressure. She pressed the gauze against it and held it, and he stood very still and looked at the opposite wall with the particular stillness of a person trying to be somewhere else in their head. "The glass," she said. "I knocked it off the counter." "Okay." "I wasn't—" He stopped, started again. "I wasn't angry. I wasn't doing anything. It slipped." "I know," she said. "I could tell." He looked down at her then, close. The kitchen was small enough that she was already well inside the radius of him, the radius she'd been carefully circling for 5 days without crossing, and this was different. She was holding his hand and she'd chosen to, and he was letting her, and the distance between those facts and their implications was shrinking. Luca's been with me since I was 22, he said. Evelyn held the gauze steady. I gave him everything, he said. Not theatrical, just flat, the flatness of a fact that was still being processed. I trusted him the way you trust someone who saves your life. He did that twice. A pause. And then he sold the number to a man who was going to use it to set up my murder. People do that, she said. The ones you trust most. I know. His jaw tightened. Knowing it doesn't change anything. No, she agreed. It doesn't. The silence between them was different now. Not the working silence, not the careful maintained professional distance. Something had leaked through from the place those things usually covered. Why did you help me at the motel? She said. Not the operational version of the question, not how did you know to come, but the real one underneath it. Damien looked at her for a moment. You called a number you'd been told to trust. Someone had to honor that. That's the what, she said, not the why. He was quiet for a moment that went on long enough to mean something. You had blood on your hands, he finally said, and you were still trying to figure out how to get yourself out. He glanced away. I've known a lot of people in bad situations. Most of them stopped thinking. You didn't. Evelyn didn't say anything. It seemed like a waste, he said quietly, to let that get killed. She was still holding his hand. She wrapped the gauze and secured it and let go, and the loss of contact was small and immediate, and they both felt it, and neither of them said anything about it. Go to sleep, she said. In a while. She left him there. Back in her room, she lay staring at the ceiling for a long time and told herself firmly and repeatedly that she was in the apartment of a dangerous man under dangerous circumstances, and the particular quality of her heartbeat was adrenaline and proximity and stress and nothing more complicated than that. She didn't quite believe it. On day 7, Nolan Mercer made his first move. It came not as violence but as pressure, the kind that worked through channels through the legitimate surface of the world. 2 men in good suits arrived at the building's lobby with federal identification and a request to speak with Evelyn Vale regarding an ongoing financial investigation. Russo called up. Damien took the call in the study and came out 2 minutes later with an expression that was very controlled and a folder in his hand. You recognize the names Harlan and Briggs, he said. Evelyn frowned. They're SEC investigators. I've seen them in meetings at the firm. She paused. Nolan's firm. Mercer sent them. They're federal agents. They're federal agents who've been building a case that Mercer has been helping them construct. He set the folder on the table. If they take you for questioning, Mercer's attorneys get access to your location. You stop being in a building I control and start being somewhere I can't protect you. Evelyn felt the architecture of it settle into place. He's using the investigation as a weapon. He's been cooperating with a federal probe into syndicate financials for 6 months, Damien said, selectively cooperating, feeding them what he wants them to see. His voice was level. He told them you stole proprietary financial data when you left. They think they're pursuing an evidence tampering case. I didn't steal anything. I know what you did. A pause. They don't. Evelyn pressed her palms flat on the table and looked at the folder and thought about Nolan's particular genius for positioning, the way he always occupied the sympathetic role in any narrative, the way he made other people's truth sound like their alibi. She'd lived with that for 8 months. She'd watched it work on friends, on colleagues, on her own perception of herself. What do I do? She said. Nothing today, Damien said. I send them away. But this is the beginning of a different kind of pressure. He looked at her steadily. He's escalating. I know. When he escalates beyond legal channels, he stopped. When he does, she said, what happens? I'll handle it. That's not an answer. No, he said, it's a promise, which is different. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. He went downstairs to deal with the men in suits, and she sat at the table with the folder and felt the specific compound weight of being someone else's problem, the guilt of it, the helplessness, and underneath both of those, the particular shame of needing rescue, which she had spent her whole adult life engineering her circumstances to avoid. That afternoon, she called her mother. The phone was a new one, untraceable, that Russo had provided on day 3. She'd been putting the call off because she didn't know what to say, and because every version of this conversation felt like pulling a pin from something. Her mother picked up on the second ring. "Evelyn," voice immediately alert. Mothers had frequencies for this. "I'm okay," Evelyn said. "I need you to know that first." "What happened? Is it Nolan? I always said that, man." "Mom." Firm. "I can't tell you everything right now. I'm somewhere safe. I need you to not try to contact me on my regular number, and I need you not to talk to anyone who calls asking about me. Anyone." Silence on the line. "Mom." "I hear you," her mother said, and her voice had gone very still in the way it did when she was scared and trying to be steady for someone else. "Are you with someone?" Evelyn thought about that. "Yes," she said. "Good person. Complicated person." Her mother made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Those are usually the same thing," she said. "Be careful, sweetheart." "I will." She hung up and sat with the phone in the complicated silence and thought, what am I doing? She wasn't sure anymore. And that uncertainty had a shape to it. Not fear exactly. Not the animal flight terror of the motel. This was something more interior. The specific disorientation of a person who has been changed by circumstances fast enough that they haven't caught up with themselves yet. On day 8, she found Damien in the study at midnight. Not working. Just sitting in the chair with the lights low, his hands loose on the armrests, looking at nothing in particular. He didn't hear her at first. Or if he did, he didn't react. And she had a full 3 seconds of watching him unobserved, watching the way he looked without the controlled surface, which was tired. Deeply, structurally tired. The kind that sleep didn't fully address because it wasn't sleep he was missing. "You should turn a light on," she said. He looked up. "Probably." She came in and sat down in the chair across from him. He didn't tell her to go to bed this time. She took that as an invitation, or at least as the absence of an objection, which was close enough. "Tell me about Bianca," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "She's 26, teaches art to kids in Evanston. She chose a different life. And you let her." "I made it possible for her to choose it." His voice was careful. "Different thing." "What does she think you do?" "She knows enough to understand why she can't know more." A pause. "She's smarter than I am, in the ways that matter." "You're not stupid." "No," he said. "But she's good. Actually good. Not—" He stopped. "Not performing it," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "Yes." She thought about that. "You think you're not good?" "I think I make necessary choices." "That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It's not." The low lamp made the shadows in the room long, and the silence between them easier to occupy. Evelyn pulled her knees up into the chair and rested her chin on them and looked at him. And he looked back at her, and neither of them moved or spoke for a moment that stretched long enough to have weight. "When this is over," she said finally, "what happens to you?" He considered. "The same thing that was happening before." "Which is—" "This," he said simply. "All of this. Continuously." He looked at his hands. "There's no after for people like me. There's just the next version of the same problem." "That's a bleak way to live." "It's an accurate way to describe it." "They're not the same," she said, echoing his phrasing back at him, and watched him catch it, and something in his expression opened slightly, a fraction, like a window that had been stuck for a long time shifting in its frame. "No," he said, "they're not." The next morning, Damien received information that the Cortez contact inside the Harrington organization had been identified. He called a meeting. He did not invite Evelyn. Russo, stationed outside the meeting room, gave her the summary afterward with the careful editorial precision of a man selecting what was and wasn't his information to pass along. The inside man was a security consultant, Russo said. He'd been feeding floor schematics and access schedules to Cortez's people for 3 months. They know exactly where Mr. Moretti will be standing during the summit. They have a clean line from the service corridor. "And now," Evelyn said, "and now they know that we know." Russo paused. which changes the timeline. How? They'll move up before we can fortify. He said it without emotion. Mr. Moretti is handling the consultant. But Cortez will know within 48 hours that his plan has been compromised. Evelyn stood very still. Which means Mercer will know. Yes. And Mercer will stop using legal pressure and start using the other kind. Russo looked at the wall. That's the assessment. She went looking for Damien. She found him on the building's private roof terrace. Cold up there, the November wind off the lake sharp and sustained. The city spread in every direction under a low gray sky. He was standing at the railing looking north, his coat pulled close, and he heard her come through the door and didn't turn around. She went and stood beside him at the railing. Below, traffic moved in tiny, purposeful streams. The lake beyond the skyline was dark and flat. Russo told me, she said. I know he did. Is the summit still happening? Yes. Damien, if I cancel it, Cortez wins without firing a shot. His voice was flat and final. I spend the next 2 years fighting a war that costs more lives than any single summit. I'm not canceling. Then you're walking into something you know is compromised. I'm walking into something I now control the variables of. He looked at her. That's different. Not by as much as you want it to be. He held her gaze. The wind pushed her hair across her face, and she didn't move to fix it. You've been in my apartment for 8 days, he said, and the way he said it meant something that wasn't about duration. I know, she said. It's making me... He stopped, jaw tightened. I make decisions based on what I can afford to lose. That's how this works. It's always been how this works. And now, she said, not a question. And now, he said, I have a harder time identifying what that is. The wind moved between them. Evelyn looked at the city below, at the cold, orderly movement of lives that had no idea this conversation was happening 42 floors above them, and felt the specific vertigo of a moment that had gathered enough weight to fall either way. She turned to face him. Then don't lose me, she said, simply, without performance. The silence that followed was the most unguarded she'd seen him. The controlled surface down, something actual and exhausted and real underneath it. The face of a man who had been carrying the architecture of his own life at arm's length for so long that being offered proximity felt like a threat and a relief at the same time. He reached out and pushed the hair from her face. His thumb stayed at her jaw for a moment. Then his phone rang. He stepped back, reached for it, looked at the screen, and his expression closed so fast it was like watching a door slam. What? Evelyn said. He looked up at her, and in his eyes was the particular flat brightness of a person who has just received information that has changed the next several hours irrevocably. The gala, he said. Tonight. I have to go. What's tonight? The Harrington pre-summit function. It's been on the calendar for 6 weeks. If I don't appear, it signals... He was already moving toward the door. I have to go. Then I'm coming with you. He stopped, turned, looked at her with an expression that was half calculation and half something that resisted calculation entirely. That's not... If you leave me here and something happens at that gala, she said, you have no one watching your back who isn't already on someone's payroll. She held his gaze. You just told me your second sold you out. Your inside contact at Harrington sold you out. How many people in that room tonight are clean? The wind pushed between them. Damien looked at her for a long, held moment. Get dressed, he said. And Evelyn Vale, who 8 days ago had been crouched against a motel room wall with 2% battery and no options, went to get dressed for the most dangerous room. The dress was black satin, and it fit like it had been made for someone else's life. Evelyn stood in front of the mirror in the guest room and looked at herself and didn't recognize the woman looking back. Not because the dress was wrong, but because everything underneath it had shifted in 8 days in ways she hadn't finished cataloging yet. The bruising on her wrists had faded to yellow-green. The cut on her palm was healing clean. She looked like a woman going to a gala. She felt like a woman walking a wire over something she couldn't see the bottom of. Russo knocked at 7:15. Car's ready, he said through the door. 1 minute. She pressed her palm flat against the mirror and looked at her own eyes and said quietly, to no one, "You're still thinking. That's enough." Then she picked up the small clutch someone had left on the bed, black, minimal, containing nothing she'd put there herself, and went out. Damien was in the entry hall. He'd changed into a dark suit that sat on him the way good clothes sit on men who don't notice them, and he was standing with his phone in his hand reading something with the focused, rapid attention of a man who was already inside the next several hours before they'd started. He looked up when she came in. The phone lowered. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You look like you're preparing to survive something." "Aren't I?" "Try to look like you're not. Work on your pep talks," she said, the almost smile. There and gone. They rode down in the elevator without speaking. Russo and two other men flanked them through the lobby and into the waiting car, and the city opened up around them in the cold November dark. Streetlights and headlights, and the distant suggestion of the lake, the city doing what it always did, indifferent and continuous, unimpressed by personal catastrophe. Damien looked out his window the whole ride. Evelyn watched his reflection in the glass. His jaw was working very slightly, the small motion of a man running through sequences in his head, checking and rechecking. She'd learned to read that in 8 days. She'd learned a lot of things in 8 days that she suspected were going to be difficult to unlearn. "Tell me what I'm walking into," she said. He turned from the window. The Harrington function is a pre-summit mixer. Roughly 200 guests, city officials, developers, a handful of people from the 3 organizations who are publicly legitimate enough to attend events like this. It happens every year. It's theater. And tonight it's theater with loaded guns behind the curtain. He looked at her steadily. "You stay within 4 feet of me. You do not go to the bar alone, the bathroom alone, or anywhere alone. If something happens, you get behind the nearest solid structure and you wait. And if you're the one something happens to," his jaw tightened by a degree, "Russo will get you out." "That's not what I asked." He held her gaze. "I know," he said, and left it there. The Harrington was a century-old building in the Loop that had started as a private club and evolved into the kind of venue that hosted events for people who needed history as a backdrop for their present. The foyer was marble and dark wood, and the kind of lighting that was designed to make everyone look slightly better than they were. A string quartet played in the corner, and nobody was listening to them. Damien walked in like he owned the building. Not arrogantly, that was the wrong word. More like a man who had long ago made his peace with the fact that every room he entered was a room he was already responsible for. He moved with complete attention, scanning without appearing to scan, acknowledging the people who approached him with the controlled social facility of someone who had learned it rather than felt it. Evelyn stayed at his side and watched. She saw the moment he identified the security consultant. Now compromised, now known, playing out his role anyway because vanishing would confirm everything. He was a gray-haired man near the East Corridor who was drinking water and not talking to anyone. His eyes moved to Damien's once and then away, and Evelyn felt the temperature drop 3 degrees in the space between them, even from across the room. "He's here," she said quietly. "I see him. He knows you know. Let him." A man in a city official's sash approached with a handshake and a loud greeting that was pure performance, and Damien received it with equal performance, and Evelyn smiled and said nothing and counted the exits. East Corridor, main entrance, service door beside the kitchen. A fire exit behind the string quartet that was probably alarmed but would open under enough pressure. 4 exits. 200 people. 1 man in a gray suit who kept touching his earpiece. She noticed the earpiece at 40 minutes in. A man near the east windows, late 30s, the kind of build that looked like civilian but moved like something else. She clocked him and then found his match on the opposite side of the room. Same build, same posture, same practiced way of looking at nothing while watching everything. She put her hand on Damien's arm. He didn't look at her, but his attention shifted. "East windows, gray jacket," she said, very low. A pause of 3 seconds. "And the opposite side," he said back. "Yes." He turned slightly to speak to her, and in the same motion his eyes made the full sweep of the room she'd already made. She watched him process it. His expression didn't change. Too soon, he said. Cortez doesn't move this fast. Maybe Cortez didn't make this call. He looked at her then. Something in his face shifted. Not alarm, but the specific recalibration of a man whose model of the situation has just been revised. Then the lights died. Not a flicker. A complete, immediate, total blackout. Every light in the building, including emergency lighting, cut in the same instant. The string quartet stopped mid-phrase. 200 people produced 200 different versions of surprise silence, and then someone screamed, and then the room became something else entirely. Evelyn felt Damien's hand close around her wrist before she'd finished processing the dark. Move, he said. They moved, not toward the exits, toward the interior wall, away from the windows, because whoever had cut the lights was outside and the windows were exposure, and Damien understood tactical geometry in his sleep. She felt the wall against her back and his body angling in front of her, and then the first shot came through the east window in a spray of glass that caught the ambient light from outside, like something briefly beautiful, and then a second shot and a third, and the room became screaming and the specific animal chaos of 200 people trying to be anywhere else. Damien's return men were moving. She could hear the disciplined motion of it through the chaos, the difference between trained and panicked bodies in the dark. And she pressed herself flat against the wall and tried to breathe through her nose and count. Something sliced across her left shoulder, not a bullet. Glass fragment from the window, caught by the angle. She registered it as heat and didn't look at it because looking at it would mean processing it. And processing it would mean losing 6 seconds she needed for other things. She saw the laser sight before Damien did. Red dot. Moving across the wall to her left, rising, tracking. She traced its origin back to the east corridor doorway. Elevated position, standing height, aimed at the space Damien occupied in the muzzle flash illumination. She shoved him. The shot came. The wall where his chest had been exploded. And then the pain arrived. Not in her shoulder where the glass had caught her, but lower, above the collarbone. Through the upper left. The specific searing geography of a round that had passed through the outer edge of her and continued, and she thought very clearly, that's a through and through. You've seen enough crime reports to know that means you're probably not dying in the next 60 seconds. Focus. She was already falling. Damien caught her. She knew it was him before she saw him because of the specific quality of how the catch happened. Not scrambling, not desperate, the practiced sureness of a man who had caught falling things before and knew how to take the weight. He went down with her, controlled, and she felt the floor against her back and his arm behind her head, and his voice saying her name in a register she'd never heard from him before. Evelyn? I'm okay, she said. Her voice was wrong, too thin. You're shot. I know, through and through, upper left, I'm okay. Stop talking. Damien, stop. His hand pressed against the wound with direct, hard pressure, and the pain redlined briefly, and she grabbed his wrist not to push him off, but to hold on to something, and he let her. Around them, the room was resolving into a different kind of chaos. Damien's men had converged. The attackers were encountering return fire. There were sirens beginning somewhere outside. The tactical situation was shifting. She could feel it even flat on her back, the specific change of momentum when violence begins to consolidate. Look at me, Damien said. She looked at him. His face was very close. In the low ambient light from outside through the shattered east windows, she could see him clearly. The complete absence of his controlled surface, the thing underneath it that he'd been containing for 8 days, which was not calm at all. His eyes were doing something she'd never seen them do, something she didn't have a clean word for. You're going to be fine, he said. I know, she said. Stop saying you know. I know, she said again, and felt the absurd specific pressure of almost laughing at the wrong moment, and felt him feel it too, the tiny fractional easing of something impossible in the middle of everything impossible. The ambulance arrived 11 minutes later. She remembered pieces of the ride, cold, the ceiling of the vehicle, a paramedic's hands, Damien sitting beside the gurney with his hand around hers and blood on his shirt that was not his own. She remembered the hospital entrance. She remembered a doctor's voice and the bright overhead lights, and then a period she didn't remember at all. When she woke, it was quiet. White ceiling, monitors. The low specific smell of hospital that no amount of industrial cleaning ever fully covered. Her left shoulder was immobilized and the pain was present but managed. The dulled, organized pain of something that has been addressed rather than the raw, unsorted pain of something new. Damien was in the chair beside the bed. He was still in the suit. The jacket was draped over the chair back. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. His hands were folded between his knees, and he was looking at the floor with the specific quality of a man who has been sitting in one place for a long time and doesn't plan to move. "How long?" she said. He looked up immediately. 4 hours. "You've been here 4 hours?" "Yes." She processed that. Her throat was dry. He anticipated it, reached for the cup of water on the bedside table and held it for her, tilting the straw toward her, and she drank, and he watched her with an expression that was entirely unguarded in a way she suspected he didn't know. "The gala," she said. "Over. 3 attackers dead, 2 taken." He sat back. "Cortez's men." "But Cortez didn't order it." He was quiet for a moment. "How did you know that?" "You said it yourself, too fast." Cortez moves methodically. She looked at the ceiling. "Someone else called this. Someone who knew about tonight and wanted to move before your timeline." Damien's hands tightened slightly between his knees. "Yes." "Who?" He was quiet long enough that she turned her head to look at him, despite the resistance from the immobilized shoulder. "Nolan," she said. "Nolan has been communicating with Cortez's secondary leadership behind Cortez's back," Damien said. His voice was very flat. "He's been building a side arrangement. He told them that I'd identified the Harrington contact, that the summit plan was compromised, and that their best window was tonight before I could fortify." Evelyn stared at the ceiling. "He burned Cortez's operation to save himself," she said. "He handed them a timeline and a venue and let them take the risk while he stayed clean." A pause. "He knew I'd be there. He knew you'd be there. He was trying to kill both of us in the same room." "Yes." The monitor beside her beeped steadily. Outside the room, somewhere down the corridor, a cart wheeled past. The ordinary infrastructure of a building full of broken people going about its business. "You took a bullet for me," Damien said. His voice had dropped into something that had no performance in it at all. "You came for me first," she said. "Motel. Remember?" He looked at her for a long moment. "That's not... It's equivalent," she said. "Don't make it into a debt." His jaw worked. He looked at his hands. He looked back at her and she could see it happening. The thing he'd been holding at arm's length for 8 days. The distance he'd maintained with the careful deliberateness of a man who knew exactly what closing it would cost. "I should let you go," he said quietly. "When this is over. Whatever that looks like. You should... There's a version of this where I set you up somewhere clean, new identity, enough money that you never have to think about any of this again." He held her gaze. "You should want that." "What I should want," she said, "and what I want are different things." "Evelyn?" "Don't," she said. "Don't manage me. I've been managed for 8 months by a man who is very good at it, and I know what it feels like, and that's not what this is, so don't." He went very still. "Every time I imagine life without you in it," he said, "it feels like something structural failing." He said it the way he said everything that was true. Flat, unadorned, without the flourish that would have made it easier to dismiss. "I don't know what to do with that." Evelyn looked at him. "Yes, you do," she said. And Damien Moretti, who had not let anyone close enough to hurt him in 11 years, who had built his entire operational existence on the principle that love was a liability and attachment was a tactical weakness, reached across the space between the chair and the bed and took her hand. Carefully. Like something he was not going to put down. She fell back asleep sometime before dawn with his hand still around hers. In the morning, everything changed. Russo came in at 8 with a face like bad weather and 2 phones in his hand, and Evelyn was already awake. The shoulder had pulled her out of sleep at 6, and she'd been lying in the gray early light, thinking about everything and coming to conclusions she didn't like. And Damien was awake immediately, the way trained people wake, complete and alert in an instant. Russo looked at Damien and said, "We have a problem." "Tell me." Russo glanced at Evelyn. Tell me, Damien repeated. Not louder, just final. Mercer made a move last night while the gala was happening, Russo said. We think it was coordinated. While our attention was on the Harrington situation, he stopped. His face did something careful and controlled that meant the next sentence was going to be bad. Bianca's convoy was hit on the I-90 connector. 3 of our men down. The car was taken. The room went absolutely silent. Evelyn watched Damien's face. She had seen him controlled. She had seen him angry in the contained way of a man who used anger as a tool rather than feeling it. She had seen him tired and unguarded and almost tender. She had not seen this, the specific white stillness that settled over him now, which was not calm at all, but the thing that lived on the other side of calm, past every managed response, in the place where a person stops deciding how to feel and simply becomes what they are. Where? He said. His voice was barely above a sound. Unknown. They switched vehicles twice. Our tracking lost the second car near the Calumet interchange. Who's on it? Everyone. Get me Mercer's known locations. All of them. Safe houses, secondary properties, anything Luca gave us before. He stopped. His eyes closed for a fraction of a second. Opened. Cross-reference everything Luca gave us as potentially compromised. Don't assume any of it is clean. Already running. Damien stood. He picked up his jacket from the chair back without looking at it. His hand found the lapel, and he held it for a moment. Not putting it on yet, just holding it. And in that pause, Evelyn saw the full weight of it land on him. The specific compound weight of a man who had spent decades keeping his sister safe and had just learned it hadn't been enough. She pushed herself upright. Don't, he said, without looking at her. Damien, you've been shot. You're staying here. He put on the jacket. His movements were precise, deliberate, the deliberateness of a man using action to keep himself from feeling the full magnitude of what he was feeling. Russo's man will stay outside the door. You don't leave this room. This is my fault, she said. He stopped, turned to face her. If Mercer is using Bianca, it's because of me, she said. Her voice was level. She was not going to fall apart in front of him right now. The drive, the motel, everything, he's escalating because of what I started. You didn't start anything, Damien said. He did. 8 months ago when he put you in a position where you'd eventually find what he was hiding. That's generous. It's accurate. He looked at her with that flat, complete honesty she'd come to expect from him. This is not your fault, but it is your problem, which means... His jaw tightened. When I find her, when this is resolved, you're going to be standing in the middle of it, whether I want you there or not. I know. I need you to understand what that means. I know what it means. You've been here 9 days. I know how long I've been here, she said. I know what you are. I know what this is. And I know that if your sister is in that man's hands because of something I set in motion, there is no version of me that sits in a hospital bed while you handle it. He looked at her. She looked back at him. When you can stand without your blood pressure dropping, he said finally, you call Russo. He left. Evelyn sat in the white hospital room and listened to his footsteps disappear down the corridor and felt the full specific weight of what had just shifted. Not between them, though that too, but inside herself. The thing she'd been calling proximity and adrenaline and circumstance for 9 days had a different shape now. It had the shape of a person she would walk toward trouble for, the shape of someone she was not going to leave. That terrified her, not because of who he was or what his world cost, because she'd been here before, not with violence and criminal organizations and gunfire, but with the simpler version, the version that was just a man who was wrong for her in ways she kept explaining to herself were manageable. And she had learned, at significant cost, that knowing the risk did not neutralize it. But this was different. She was different. 9 days had done that. She pressed the call button for the nurse. I need to know my discharge timeline, she said when the nurse appeared. The nurse looked at her chart. Dr. Voss wants to keep you for observation until... I'm not asking what Dr. Voss wants, Evelyn said. I'm asking what my medical status is if I choose to leave. The nurse looked at her for a moment. You'd be leaving AMA. Against medical advice? Yes. I understand that. What are the actual risks? A pause. The wound is clean. You'd need to keep it dressed and avoid significant physical exertion. A longer pause. And you'd need someone to monitor you for signs of, I have someone, Evelyn said. She was dressed and standing when Russo's man knocked on the door 40 minutes later. Mr. Moretti said, when you can stand, the man said, looking at her with the careful, neutral expression of someone who had been told this was a possibility and was not entirely surprised. I'm standing, she said. The drive back to the penthouse was not the drive she'd expected. Instead of the Gold Coast, they headed south, toward the river, into the older industrial sections of the city where the streets got wider and less maintained and the buildings were warehouses and former manufacturing plants, the bones of a different Chicago showing through. Russo was in the car. He looked at her shoulder and looked at her face and said nothing, which she appreciated. Where are we going? She said. Mr. Moretti is working a location, Russo said. He wanted you brought when you were ready. He wanted me brought. He said, Russo paused, with the particular care of a man choosing exact words. He said she'll come anyway, so bring her when she can walk straight. Evelyn looked out the window. She thought about the photograph turned face down. The woman standing at the lake not knowing the picture was being taken. 26 years old, teaching art to children in Evanston, living the life her brother had made space for her to choose. In a car somewhere in this city because of a flash drive Evelyn had copied on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks ago. The guilt was not abstract. It had mass and texture, and it sat in her chest next to the clean-through wound, and she breathed around it and didn't put it down because it wasn't the kind of thing you put down. It was the kind of thing you carried until you'd done enough to balance the weight. They pulled into the parking structure of a building she didn't recognize. And Russo got out, and she got out, and they went up 2 flights of concrete stairs and through a metal door into a space that had once been something industrial. Concrete floor, high ceilings, the ghost of old equipment in the wear patterns on the ground. Damien was at a folding table in the center of the space with 4 men and 2 laptops and a paper map of the south side spread out under 4 coffee cups used as weights. He looked up when she came in. Something crossed his face. Relief, quickly managed, and underneath the relief a quality she hadn't seen before. He looked at her shoulder, at the careful way she was holding herself, and looked back at her face, and what she saw in his expression was the specific, unguarded collision of a man who wanted her somewhere safer and knew that wasn't her, and was in the process of accepting both things simultaneously. Mercer's reached out, he said without preamble. Evelyn crossed the room to the table. He sent a message 20 minutes ago, Damien said. He slid a phone across the table. She looked at the screen. The message was brief. Trade Evelyn for Bianca. Midnight, the Calumet Yard. No tricks or the sister comes back in pieces. You have until 10 p.m. to confirm. Evelyn read it twice. She put the phone back on the table, looked up at Damien. His face was perfectly still. Every man in the room was looking somewhere other than at either of them. The deliberate avoidance of people who understood that what was happening between the 2 people at the center of the table was not their business, and was also the only thing in the room that actually mattered. No, Damien said. His voice was very quiet. Damien, no. If Bianca dies because I'm standing here, then that's on him, Damien said, with a force that was still controlled but barely. That is entirely, completely, solely on Nolan Mercer. Not on you. Not on me, Damien said, and Evelyn cut across him before the sentence could finish landing. Stop. He stopped. She looked at him across the table with the paper map between them and the 4 men pretending to study their laptops and the single overhead bulb throwing hard shadows across everything, and she said quietly, I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. The room was very still. Damien's eyes had gone to that place she'd first seen in the hospital, past controlled, past the managed surface, into the white stillness that was the territory beyond every prepared response he had. His jaw was tight enough that she could see the muscle working along the line of it. You walk into that yard, he said, and you're betting your life on my ability to run a clean extraction in a compromised environment against a man who has already demonstrated he'll burn his own people to save himself. I know. Evelyn. I know all of that, she said, and I'm still telling you what I'm going to do. She held his gaze. So the question isn't whether I go. The question is whether you send me in alone or whether you build something around it. The silence stretched for 6 seconds. She counted. Then Damien looked at the map. "Sit down," he said. "Both of you sit down." They worked for 3 hours. The Calumet Yard was a decommissioned rail facility on the far southeast side. 16 acres of rusted infrastructure, abandoned switching houses, container storage, the bones of industrial Chicago left to weather and corrode. Damien had people who knew the layout. He had people who knew every viable sniper position within a quarter mile, every approach route, every shadow. What he didn't have was certainty, and Evelyn watched him build the plan around the absence of certainty the way a structural engineer builds around a known fault, not ignoring it, not pretending it didn't exist, but designing the load-bearing elements so that when it failed, and it would fail somewhere, the whole thing didn't collapse at once. "Mercer will have people at the entrance points," Damien said, moving his finger across the map. "He'll want visual confirmation you're walking in before he does anything. That means he needs you visible, which means we know where you'll be." "And where Bianca will be," Evelyn said. "Not necessarily. He'll keep her separate until the exchange, out of your line of sight." He tapped a spot on the map. "The switching house at the north end has 2 floors. Elevated position, sight lines to both the primary meeting point and the container rows. That's where I'll be." "How close?" 80 meters. "That's not close." 80 meters is close. He looked at her. "I've worked with less." She looked at the map and thought about 80 meters in an open yard in the dark and the specific distance between a decision and its consequences at that range. "The moment Bianca is clear," Damien said, "my men move. Everything happens at once. You get behind whatever is nearest. I don't care what it is. And you stay there." "And Mercer," Damien's finger lifted from the map. "Mercer is mine," he said. Simply, without elaboration. The kind of sentence that didn't need any. She confirmed the exchange at 9:47 p.m. via the burner phone Mercer had used for his message. 2 words. Calumet, midnight. He responded within 90 seconds with coordinates. The center of the main yard, open ground, floodlit, which told her he was either confident or reckless or both. Russo fitted her with a vest at 11:15. She stood in the center of the warehouse space while he adjusted the straps, and she breathed carefully through the pressure on her shoulder, the wound making itself loudly known every time something touched it. And she stared at the far wall and thought about nothing specific, the way she'd learned to think about nothing specific before a high-stakes audit presentation, before any situation where the body needed to be functional and panic was not an option. "Too tight?" Russo asked. "It's fine." He looked at her face. "You don't have to do this." "I know." "Mr. Moretti would find another Russo," she said. "I know." He finished the straps and stepped back, and she looked down at the vest under her jacket and thought, 9 days ago, I was barefoot in a motel room with blood on my hands and 2% battery. Look at what I've become. She wasn't sure if that thought was meant to be steadying or alarming. She decided it was neither and let it go. Damien came to her at 11:30, not to review the plan. The plan was reviewed. He came and stood in front of her and looked at her face in the way he'd been doing for days now, the way that was no longer pretending to be anything other than what it was. "If anything feels wrong when you get there," he said, "you abort. You turn around and you walk back to the car, and we find another way." "If I abort, Bianca, is not your responsibility," he said. His hand came up and touched her jaw, briefly, the same gesture from the rooftop, and her whole nervous system registered it through the cold and the adrenaline and the dull fire in her shoulder. "She is my responsibility. You are not expendable in exchange for her. Do you understand that?" "She's your sister." "You are not expendable," he repeated, with a force and a flatness that meant he had said this to himself several times already tonight, and was saying it to her now because he needed her to carry it with her. "Okay," she said. "Say it back." She looked at him. "I'm not expendable." He held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he dropped his hand and turned to the table and picked up his jacket and the weapon she'd seen him check and recheck twice in the last hour, and said, without turning back, "Let's go." The Calumet Yard was everything the map had promised, and nothing the map could fully communicate. Standing at the chain link entrance at 11:58, with 2 of Damien's men visible in her peripheral vision, and 12 more somewhere she couldn't see, and the wind off the lake cutting through her jacket like it had an agenda, Evelyn looked at the open ground ahead and felt the full specific weight of the choice she'd made. Floodlights on rusted towers threw white pools across the yard. Between them, shadow, the kind of deep industrial shadow that swallowed detail and made distance unreliable. Somewhere ahead, on open ground, Nolan Mercer was waiting with a weapon and a hostage and the particular certainty of a man who had never believed in consequences. She walked in. Her footsteps on the gravel sounded very loud. She counted them. It was something to do with the part of her brain that wanted to run. Give it arithmetic. Give it a task. Keep it from tipping into the frequency that made people freeze or bolt or do the wrong thing at the wrong moment. 42 steps to the edge of the first floodlight pool. 61 to the rusted hulk of an old switching car. 78 to the place where the shadows opened again and the main yard spread out under the cold flood of the overhead lights. Mercer was already there. He looked smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing. The specific deflation of someone you've been afraid of for weeks when you finally face them in open air. He was 41 years old and well-dressed even here, even now, the charcoal overcoat she recognized from the firm's annual dinner, and he was holding a phone in one hand and standing with the particular stillness of a man containing a great deal of agitation through force of will. Bianca was to his left, restrained, wrists behind her back, with a man holding her arm, someone Evelyn didn't recognize, built like a load-bearing wall. Bianca was dark-haired and smaller than Evelyn had imagined from Russo's description, and her face was cut above one eye from the convoy, but she was standing upright, and her expression was not terror. It was the cold, furious composure of a woman who had been taken and was already planning. She was Damien's sister. That tracked. "Evelyn," Mercer said. His voice was warm. Professionally warm, the warmth he used in client meetings, the warmth she had once found reassuring. "You look terrible." "You look desperate," she said. His jaw tightened. "Walk forward." "Let her go first." "That's not how this works." "That's the only way this works," Evelyn said. "You want me. She has nothing you need. Let her walk." "When you're standing in front of me, Nolan." She said his name the way she'd said it 8 months of mornings. Flat, familiar, stripped of performance. "You're not going to shoot me in the middle of the yard before you have what you want. So we're at an impasse unless one of us moves first. And I'm telling you, the one thing that moves me is watching her walk away from your man." Mercer looked at her. She looked back. This was the thing she knew about him, that his criminal connections and his financial arrangements and his assassination plots had not changed. He was at his core a man who needed to believe he was the smartest person in the room. And the way to manage that was to let him think she was afraid of him, which she was, and to let him think she was acting on desperation, which she was, and to not let him see the other thing, the thing underneath both of those, which was that she was buying time in 20-second increments and counting them. "Fine," he said. He nodded at the man holding Bianca. The man released her arm. Bianca didn't run immediately. She turned and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was complicated and rapid and contained several things that would need to be talked about at some future point. And then she walked east toward the container rows, deliberately, not hurrying, and Evelyn watched her go with the specific practiced peripheral tracking of someone trying to watch 2 things at once without appearing to watch either. She counted. 30 seconds. Bianca was at the containers. "Your turn," Mercer said. Evelyn took 3 steps forward, then stopped. "The drive," she said. "You want it." "I want you," he said, and the warmth had entirely left his voice now, replaced by the thing it had been covering, which was cold and focused and genuinely dangerous. "You and every copy you've made and every person you've told and every—" "There are no copies," she said. "There's the drive, and there's what's in my head. You can't do anything about the second one." "I can." "Then why are we here? Why the exchange? Why not just—" She stopped. "Let it sit." "Because you need it to look clean. You're still trying to manage the narrative, even now. Walk forward." "What did they offer you?" she said. "Cortez's people. When you went around Cortez's back and sold his operation out to his lieutenants, what was the number? Mercer's face did something she recognized. The flicker of surprise he covered with aggression, the tell she'd learned in 8 months of watching him negotiate. Coastal distribution, she said. Access to the port routes. Damien controls those. She watched his face. But Damien was going to survive the summit, and you needed him gone. So you moved up the timeline and sent Cortez's people into that ballroom, and you didn't care who else was in the room. She held his gaze. I was in that room. You were in that room, he agreed, because you made a choice to be. You made a lot of choices, Evelyn. You copied those files. You texted that number. You decided to stay. His voice had dropped into something almost conversational, almost the voice she'd known, which was worse than shouting. Every single consequence of this is a choice you made. You're right, she said, and I'm making another one. She put her hand inside her jacket. Mercer's man to his right raised a weapon. She slowly, deliberately pulled out the flash drive, held it up. The floodlight caught the plastic casing. This is the original, she said. No copies. I'm holding it. It's the only leverage I have, and I'm holding it in front of you. She let him look at it for 3 full seconds. So here's the choice I'm making. You release me, and Bianca walks out of here, and I give you the drive, and this ends. Or you don't, and I drop this on the ground right now and crush it under my heel, and you get nothing, and whatever you've promised Cortez's people you can't deliver. Mercer's eyes were on the drive. You wouldn't, he said. 8 days ago, I'd never seen a man get shot in front of me, she said. Try me. The standoff lasted 6 seconds. Then Mercer smiled. Slow, precise, the smile she should have been afraid of and wasn't because she was already tracking movement behind him. The shadow at the north switching house that had resolved itself, imperceptibly, over the last 90 seconds, into something with a shape. Evelyn, Mercer said, do you think I'm stupid enough to come here without a contingency? He raised his phone. 3 calls go out if I don't send a code in the next 60 seconds. 1 to the federal investigators with the evidence that you conspired with a known criminal organization. 1 to a journalist with the same evidence. And 1, his voice went very quiet, very deliberate, to Bianca Moretti's location right now. Because she didn't walk out of my reach. I moved her to a secondary location 2 hours ago. The woman you watched walk away is one of my people. The ground dropped out from under everything. Evelyn didn't move. She held the drive and held her face and felt the specific shattering sensation of a plan coming apart at its structural center. The drive, Mercer said, holding out his hand. And your phone. And you walk with me and Bianca comes home in the morning. She looked at him. She looked at the drive in her hand. She looked at the shadow at the north switching house that had gone very still in the way things go still before they move. And then she heard it. Not a sound exactly, but the absence of one. The particular held silence of a moment right before everything moves at once. And she understood, with a clarity that arrived below conscious thought, that Damien had heard every word through the wire Russo had fitted along with the vest, and that he had also heard the part about Bianca's real location, and that the absolute stillness from the switching house was not hesitation, it was aim. I need 30 seconds, she said to Mercer, to think. You have 10. I need 30, she said, and she said it clearly and steadily, and it was not for Mercer. It was for the man 80 meters away. 30 seconds. Mercer's expression shifted. Not suspicious, not yet, but reading the edges of something he couldn't place. Fine, he said. 30. She counted. The wind off the lake moved through the yard and the floodlights hummed, and somewhere in the container rows, a piece of rusted metal shifted and rang against itself in the cold. At 27, Mercer's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. His face changed. Your 30 seconds just ended, he said, and his voice had lost every quality it normally had. The warmth, the control, the professional finish, and what was underneath was just flat animal panic dressed as aggression. He stepped toward her. Give me the shot from the switching house took the phone out of his hand. Mercer screamed, not from injury but from shock, the scream of a man who has just had the world remade around him in an instant, and stumbled back, and his man to the right raised his weapon, and Evelyn dropped. Not fell. Dropped. Deliberately. Fast, the way Russo had told her. The moment anything moves, you go down, You don't think about the shoulder, you go down. The yard exploded. Not metaphorically. The coordinated entry of 12 men through 6 points of access was a physical concussive event. Vehicles, boots on gravel, voices shouting in the practiced shorthand of people who have done this before, and underneath all of it the flat cracks of weapons being used with specific intent. Evelyn pressed herself flat against the cold gravel and put her hands over her head and breathed through her nose and counted, because that was what she did when she needed to not come apart. She counted. The man to Mercer's right was down in the first 8 seconds. The secondary man, the one near the east container wall, lasted 3 more. Mercer ran. He ran for the south exit, the one that wasn't on the map Damien had shown her, the one she'd memorized anyway because she had gone through every schematic Russo had sourced. And he was fast, Mercer, faster than a man in a charcoal overcoat had any right to be, and he was going to make the gap in the fence before anyone cut him off. Evelyn got up. Her shoulder screamed. She ran anyway, not toward Mercer. She knew she couldn't catch him on the straight. She ran diagonal, across the center of the yard, cutting the angle, heading for the rusted switching car at the yard's south edge, the one she'd counted 61 steps to on the way in. She hit it at full speed and pressed behind it, and looked south, and Mercer was 20 feet from the fence gap, and she looked at the ground, and there was a section of displaced rail plate, 2 feet of corrugated steel, and she didn't think about it. She picked it up with both hands. The shoulder went white. She threw it anyway. It caught Mercer across the back of both knees. Not a weapon, not a designed projectile, just mass and momentum and the specific arc of desperation. And he went down hard on the gravel, overcoat and all, and hit the ground with the sound of a large thing landing badly. She was on him before he could get his arms under himself. Not to hurt him. She didn't have the weight or the training, and her shoulder was failing audibly, the wound pulling against itself with every movement. She sat on his back and put her knee into the space between his shoulder blades and grabbed his right wrist and pulled it back and held it there, which was enough to keep a disoriented man pinned for the 30 seconds it took heavy boots to arrive on the gravel around her. "Get off him," a voice said. Russo. She got off. She stood up and her legs were shaking, properly shaking now, the post-adrenaline dissolution of the muscles that had been running on emergency reserves for 20 minutes. And Russo had Mercer face down with a knee in his back and 2 other men flanking, and the yard was resolving into the aftermath of something. Weapons lowered, voices lower, the transition from chaos to controlled. Evelyn looked for Damien. He was coming across the yard at a walk. She recognized the walk. She'd seen it at the motel. Deliberate. Unhurried. The walk of a man for whom urgency was a choice rather than a reflex, who had already decided what the next several minutes were going to contain and was moving through them without rushing. He looked at Mercer on the ground. He looked at Evelyn. His eyes went to her shoulder, the way she was holding her right arm under her left elbow to keep her left arm from hanging, and then back to her face. And the look on his face in that moment was the most uncovered she had ever seen him. "Bianca," she said. "We have her location," he said. "My men have been there for 10 minutes. She's okay. She's okay." His voice was flat and controlled, and she could hear underneath it everything he was not saying. He came to a stop in front of her. "You ran," he said. "I know. I had a clear line to the south exit. I know that too." "Then why?" "Because I was faster," she said. Which was not completely true, and both of them knew it. The real answer was, because he was going to get away, and it was my fault he was here, and I'm not sitting at the back of this anymore. She'd been sitting at the back of things for 8 months. She was done with it. Damien looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and pulled her against him, carefully, avoiding the shoulder, one hand at the back of her head. And she felt the full weight of him, the relief in it, the tension that had been running through him for hours, releasing incrementally against the fact of her being upright and breathing. She pressed her face against his chest and let herself shake for exactly 10 seconds. Then she straightened. "Mercer," she said. Damien stepped back. His expression had closed back into the controlled version, but the edges of it were different now, permanently different. The way a thing looks after, it's been under enough pressure to change its structure. He looked at Nolan Mercer, face down on the gravel of a rail yard he'd chosen because he thought he had the angles figured out. And then he looked at Evelyn, and she looked back at him. And the question in his face was one she understood. What happens now? He said 3 calls go out if he doesn't send a code, she said. Federal investigators, a journalist, and Bianca's location. She met his gaze. The calls haven't gone out, which means either the deadline passed and the contingency failed, or the deadline is tied to his phone. Damien reached down and picked up the pieces of the phone from where the shot had separated it from Mercer's hand. 2 pieces. The screen destroyed. No code sent from this number in the last 40 minutes, Russo said, looking at a device in his hand. Mercer on the ground said nothing. He was breathing hard, cheek against the gravel, and his eyes were tracking everything with the rapid, desperate intelligence of a man who was still calculating even here, even now. The 3 contacts, Damien said. The journalist, the federal contact. Who are they? Mercer said nothing. Damien crouched. His voice went very quiet. The specific quiet she'd first heard in room 214 of the Lakeview Motor Inn. The quiet that didn't need volume to carry everything it needed to carry. You are going to tell me, he said, because the alternative is that I stop having a reason to keep this structured. He paused. And you don't want that. Mercer's jaw worked. The federal contact is Harlan, Evelyn said. Damien looked at her. The SEC investigator, she said. The one who came to the building. Mercer's been managing him for 6 months, feeding him selective information. Harlan's not independent. He's an asset. She looked down at Mercer, and the journalist is whoever covers the syndicate beat at the Tribune, because that's the only outlet Nolan actually reads. She crouched to Mercer's level. Right, Nolan. His eyes shifted to her face. You've been managing me for 8 months, she said. I learned from the best. The gravel was cold under her knee. Her shoulder was a sustained, bright agony that she was allocating a specific corner of her attention to containing. Around her, the yard was quiet now, the aftermath settling into the particular stillness of a situation that has found its resolution. Almost. Not yet. Because Mercer's eyes moved. Not to her, not to Damien, but to a point somewhere over her left shoulder, and his expression did something involuntary, a fractional shift of something that might have been relief or might have been a signal, and Evelyn's body understood it before her mind did. She turned. The man was coming from the container rows. Not one of Damien's wrong posture, wrong movement pattern, the walk of someone operating on his own timeline who hadn't been part of any coordinated entry. He was 20 meters away and closing, and he had a weapon raised, and he was not looking at Damien. He was looking at her. Mercer's contingency. Not a phone code. Not calls to journalists. A person. Left in the yard, patient, waiting for exactly this moment, the moment after the chaos, when the extraction was done and the primary threat was neutralized and everyone's attention had consolidated around the man on the ground. Evelyn had half a second. She heard Damien move behind her, the sharp, decisive sound of a man reacting. And she heard Russo shout something she didn't process, and she looked at the man 20 meters away with the weapon aimed at her center mass and thought very clearly, this is the one I didn't plan for. The shot came from the left. Not from the man with the weapon. From Damien, who had already moved. Not in front of her, not the instinct of a body throwing itself between a threat and a person it wanted to protect. But laterally, angled, the shot fired from a position that cleared her completely and took the contingency man in the right shoulder before he'd finished his trigger pull. The contingency man's round went into the gravel 3 feet to Evelyn's right. He went down on one knee. Russo was on him in 4 seconds. Evelyn stood in the cold yard with her ears ringing and her heart doing something percussive and unscheduled in her chest, and looked at Damien, who had already lowered the weapon and was looking back at her with an expression that was stripped of everything except what it actually was. I had him, Damien said. I know, she said. Her voice was steady. She was not steady. But the voice was, and she had learned in the last 9 days that sometimes the voice was enough. That if the voice held, the rest of it had something to organize around. Russo zip-tied the contingency man's good wrist to his ankle and stood up and looked at the assembled mess of the yard. Mercer still face down, the contingency man incapacitated, 3 of Damien's men standing perimeter with weapons lowered, the floodlights humming overhead in the cold, and said, with the particular exhaustion of a man who has had a very long night. I think that's all of them. Think, Damien said. I'm 92% confident, Russo said. Find the other 8%. Russo went. Damien holstered his weapon and came to stand in front of Evelyn and looked at her shoulder, which was communicating its condition clearly through her entire left side, and then at her face. Hospital, he said. In a minute. Now. Mercer first, she said. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he turned to Mercer, who had been hauled to his knees by one of the perimeter men and was kneeling on the gravel in his charcoal overcoat with blood on his cheekbone from where the ground had found it, and the specific expression of a man in the process of rapid internal recalculation. Damien crouched in front of him. The quiet returned. The specific quiet. The federal contact, Damien said. The journalist. Any other contingencies I should know about? Mercer looked at him. His jaw was working. She could see him sorting through options. The habitual rapid triage of a man who had operated for years on the principle that there was always a play, always an angle, always a version of the situation where he came out ahead. She had watched him do it at dinner tables and in board meetings and in the quiet of their apartment when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She watched him find nothing. Harlan, Mercer said finally. His voice was flat. Done. Harlan is the federal contact. He's been on retainer for 3 years. I have proof of that in a separate location. A pause. The journalist is Marcus Yee, Tribune Financial Desk. He doesn't know what he has. I gave him fragments, enough to open an investigation, not enough to print anything yet. Where's Yee's material? Encrypted drive. My secondary office on Walker. 4th floor, filing cabinet marked Archive 7. His eyes moved to Evelyn. She knows the building. She did. She'd been to that office twice. The separate location, Damien said. The Harlan proof. Safety deposit box, Harris Bank on Michigan. Key is in my coat pocket. A pause. Left inside. Russo, returning from his perimeter sweep, reached into Mercer's coat without ceremony and produced a small key on a plain ring. He held it up. Damien stood. He looked at Nolan Mercer kneeling on the gravel of the Calumet yard, and Mercer looked back at him, and what passed between them in that moment had nothing theatrical in it. No speech, no pronouncement, no performance. Just 2 men and the full weight of every choice that had brought them to this specific piece of cold ground. There are 3 federal investigators I trust who are not Harlan, Damien said. You're going to be in their custody before morning. Mercer frowned, confused. You're turning me over. You laundered money for a cartel and arranged an assassination, Damien said. The federal case that Harlan was supposed to manage disappears when Harlan is removed. What replaces it is the case built from your own files. He paused. The drive, the communications, the Cortez operation, your secondary arrangement with the lieutenants. He looked at Mercer with the flat certainty of a man who has thought this through completely. You'll spend the rest of your life in a federal facility, which is a longer life than the alternative, so I suggest you appreciate the distinction. Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then, with the reflexive instinct of a man who couldn't help himself even now, You're doing this because of her. Damien didn't answer. She's changed you, Mercer said. You would have handled this differently before her. Yes, Damien said simply. I would have. He turned away. Get him in the car. The drive to the hospital was quiet. Evelyn sat in the back seat with her head against the window and watched the city move past in its 3 a.m. configuration, empty streets, lit windows in tall buildings, the infrastructure of a place that never fully slept but reached a specific depth in the small hours where the surfaces fell away and only the functional essentials remained. She felt like that, stripped to the functional essentials. The shoulder was a sustained deep fire, and the rest of her was the specific hollowness that came after the body had run on emergency reserves for too long and was now presenting the bill. Damien was beside her. He wasn't touching her. He was simply there, in the way he'd been there for 9 days, present, close, not requiring anything from the proximity except the proximity itself. She had come to understand that this was its own language for him. The man who maintained distance from everything had a very specific vocabulary for the absence of distance. Bianca, she said. Safe. She's at a secure location with 2 of my people. I'll see her tomorrow. A pause. Today. She knows about me. She'll want to meet you, he said. She's not afraid of what I am. She's always been clearer about it than I wanted her to be. Is that why you kept the photograph face down? A long pause. I turned it down the night Luca's name came up, he said. I didn't want to look at her while I was processing what I was going to have to do. Another pause. I forgot I'd left it. Evelyn looked at the city through the window. You didn't forget, she said. He was quiet. You left it down because it reminded you that the people closest to you are the most exposed, she said, and having me in the apartment was already making you think about that. The silence that followed had the quality of a confirmed thing neither of them needed to elaborate on. You're very perceptive, he said. It's occasionally inconvenient. I know, she said, and closed her eyes. The hospital kept her for 36 hours. The wound had reopened during the run across the yard and required 3 additional sutures and a lecture from a night shift attending physician who had seen enough to understand the context of her injury without needing it, explained and delivered his medical instructions with the careful neutrality of someone who had made a professional decision to not ask questions he didn't want answered. Damien was there when she woke the second time. Different clothes. He'd slept somewhere and changed and come back. And the fact of that, the returning, the coming back, was something she was going to have to get used to, the way you got used to things that you had not expected to be permanent. He was on the phone when she opened her eyes, and he ended the call without finishing the sentence he'd been in the middle of. Mercer, she said, in federal custody as of 6 this morning. The 3 investigators I trust have the complete file. Harlan's been suspended pending investigation. He set the phone on the bedside table. Marcus Yee received an anonymous package this morning containing a more complete version of the story than Mercer gave him, the kind that implicates Harlan and Mercer without implicating anyone else. The kind you curated, she said. The kind that's accurate, he said, which was both a correction and a confirmation. Cortez, she said. Cortez's secondary leadership, the men Mercer was working with, have been handled. A pause. Cortez himself has been informed that his operation in this city is over, and that continuing it would be inadvisable. He's pragmatic. He'll find another market. And the Harrington Summit. Postponed. Not canceled. There are conversations that need to happen in smaller rooms first. He looked at her steadily. It will happen. It just takes longer this way. Evelyn nodded. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at her bandaged shoulder. She looked at the window and the gray November sky outside. The clouds low and continuous the way Chicago did November. The city going about its enormous and different business below. What happens now, she said. Damien was quiet for a moment. When she turned to look at him, she found him watching her with the expression she'd first seen in the warehouse. The one that had replaced the controlled surface permanently, or at least made the controlled surface thinner, more permeable. The way material gets after it's been under enough stress. Now you have options, he said. Tell me. I can set you up somewhere clean. New identity, resources, completely separate from this. You disappear and stay disappeared, and Mercer is in federal custody, and he can't reach you. He held her gaze. That's one option. What's the other one? He didn't answer immediately. She watched him hold the weight of it. The thing he'd been holding at arm's length for 9 days, the thing that the gravel yard and the shot and the specific moment when she'd gotten up and run had made impossible to hold at arm's length anymore. You stay, he said. Not because you have to. Not because it's the safest choice. He paused. Because you want to. Evelyn looked at him. And what does staying look like? She said. Complicated, he said. Difficult in ways I can tell you about and ways I can't predict. I have a life that doesn't simplify, and I'm not going to tell you it does. He held her gaze with the total honesty she'd come to understand was his particular form of respect. The refusal to manage her perception, to sell her a version of the situation that was easier to accept. But you'd be safe. Actually safe, not the version I offered at the motel when I didn't know you yet. There's a difference, she said. There's a significant difference, he said. She was quiet for a moment. I want to open something, she said. I want to do something that's mine, not connected to, not funded by anything that has to stay unnamed. She looked at him carefully. That's a condition. What kind of something? Art, she said, community-based, for women who need a place that's theirs. She paused. I've been thinking about it for 2 years. I just never had I was waiting for Nolan to stop making it impractical. A pause. He kept finding reasons it was impractical. That's what you want, he said. That's part of what I want. He looked at her. I'll fund it under a legitimate non-profit structure, he said. No name attached, fully clean. He paused. If that's what you want. Fully clean, she repeated. You have my word. She looked at her hands, the bandaged left palm, the healed cut, the wrists where the bruising had faded to almost nothing now. She thought about the motel and the drive and the phone at 2% and the choice she'd made when she dialed a number she'd been told never to call. Okay, she said. Damien held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the way he confirmed things that mattered. Without ceremony, without performance, with the complete weight of actual intention. The discharge took another morning. The paperwork, the instructions, the nurse with the careful neutral expression who asked if she had someone to monitor her recovery, and she said yes, she had someone, and left it at that. She stood at the hospital entrance in the cold November light, with the city spread around her in every direction, and took a long breath of air that smelled like exhaust and lake and the specific metallic cold of a Midwestern November, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Present tense. Just this. Just now. Damien was at the curb with the car. She walked to it. 6 months pass the way things pass when the crisis is over and the ordinary machinery of life reasserts itself. Not quickly, not all at once, but steadily, the way a river resumes its course after a flood. Nolan Mercer was indicted on 47 federal counts. The case was built from his own files, his own communications, the operational records that Evelyn's stolen flash drive had started and federal investigators had completed. Harlan was removed, prosecuted separately, and became the kind of cautionary example that federal agencies discuss in training for the next decade. Marcus Yee's investigation ran across 4 Tribune front pages and won a regional journalism award and had nothing in it that touched Damien Moretti because the story, curated carefully, told the truth it needed to tell and stopped where it needed to stop. Cortez relocated. His lieutenants, the ones who had taken Mercer's arrangement and moved on the gala, were handled in ways that didn't make the news and didn't need to. The Harrington Summit happened in February. Smaller rooms, as Damien had said. The peace it produced was not clean and not permanent, but it was real, which is what peace usually is. Not an absence of conflict, but a sustained calculation that continuing costs more than stopping. The Art Center opened on a Tuesday in March. It occupied the ground floor of a building on the near west side, in a neighborhood that was in the specific process of deciding what it was going to be next, which made it the right kind of place for something new. Evelyn had spent 3 months planning it and 6 weeks renovating it with her own hands where the shoulder allowed, which was more places than the doctors had predicted because she had turned out to be stubborn about recovery in the same way she was stubborn about most things. She called it Halstead House, for the street the motel had been on, because she had learned in the months since that you didn't rename the things that had changed you. You carried them forward and let them mean something different. The center provided studio space, legal advocacy resources, transitional housing referrals. It served women who were in the process of leaving situations they should not have been in, which was a category Evelyn understood from the inside out. She hired 2 full-time staff members and 3 part-time instructors, and on the day it opened, she stood in the main studio space surrounded by the smell of fresh paint and new wood, and looked at what she had built and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a long time. Damien did not attend the opening. He had offered. She had told him she needed that space to be separate, not from him, but from the weight of what they were to each other, the specific gravity of it. She needed one room where she walked in as herself, not as the woman who had been shot in the Harrington ballroom, not as the woman Damien Moretti looked at the way he looked at her, just herself. He had understood that without argument, which was one of the things about him she had come to trust most. He sent flowers. No card. She knew they were from him because they were the specific kind she'd mentioned once, weeks earlier, in passing, in a conversation about something else entirely, the way you mention things when you're not thinking about whether someone is paying attention. He was always paying attention. They were finding the shape of it together, the two of them, the thing between them, the life that was being built from materials that weren't simple and circumstances that hadn't been chosen. It didn't look like anything she'd imagined for herself. It was harder than she'd expected, and more specific, and more honest. And on the nights when she woke from the motel dream, the flickering lamp, the voices below, the 2% battery, she found him there, always, awake in the particular way of someone who had not been asleep. He never asked about the dream. He didn't need to. "You're safe," he would say, and the words were plain and unornamented and carried everything they needed to carry. She believed them. In late April, on a Tuesday evening, when the city had finally turned warm enough to open the penthouse windows and the lake was visible in the distance as a flat gray line under a clearing sky, Damien drove her to the south side. She knew where they were going before they got there. The Lakeview Motor Inn had been closed since November. The parking lot was empty, the vacancy sign dark, the building in that specific state of abandonment that came after a significant event and before a decision about what happened next. The crime scene tape was long gone. The windows on the second floor were boarded. They stood in the parking lot in the mild spring dark, and she looked at the building and felt the specific compression of everything that had happened between that night and this one. All of it, the weight and cost of it, the things lost and the things found, and the irreversible alterations to the shape of her life. "You know," she said, "I almost didn't send that text." Damien looked at her. The streetlight caught the lines of his face, older looking than his age, the specific aging of accumulated weight, but different than it had been in November. Something in it less clenched, less like a man holding structure together by force. "If you hadn't," he said, "I would have died eventually." She looked at him. "That's dramatic." "No." He reached out and touched her face, his thumb at the line of her jaw, the gesture that had started on the rooftop and had never fully stopped being significant. "I just wouldn't have known it yet." She looked at his face in the dim light and thought about the man who had come through a door in a smoke-filled hallway and crouched to her level and asked who touched you in a voice that was quiet enough to mean something, and thought about the photograph face down on the shelf and the broken glass in the kitchen sink and the 3 a.m. silences and the way he'd sat in a hospital chair for 4 hours without moving and the way he'd caught her in the rail yard like something he was not going to put down. She thought about what it cost to let someone close enough to change you. She thought about what it cost not to. "I wasn't looking for any of this," she said. "I know," he said. "I want you to know that." She held his gaze. "I didn't walk into that motel room because I was looking for something to hold on to. I walked in because I had no other options." "I know that too." "And then I stayed," she said. "Not because I was afraid to leave. I stayed because—" She stopped, found the words. "Because I saw you, the actual version, and I wasn't willing to pretend I hadn't." His hand was still at her jaw. "I'm not easy," he said, with the flatness of a fact he was not apologizing for. "No," she agreed. "This life, I know what this life is," she said. "I've been in it for 6 months. I'm not confused about it." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she had no clean word for. The one that lived in the place past his controlled surface, in the territory that she had apparently become the only person with access to. It was exhausted, and it was careful, and it was, underneath both of those things, something that had no armor on it at all. "Okay," he said. "Just that." She turned back to look at the motel one more time. The building stood in the dark the way buildings stood, indifferent to the weight of what had happened inside them, made of material that didn't carry memory, even when the people who'd passed through it did. She thought about the girl who had pressed herself against that far wall with blood on her hands and 2% battery and no options, and thought about what that girl would make of this moment, standing in the parking lot 6 months later with a healed shoulder and a running art center and this man beside her. She thought the girl would be surprised. And then she thought, no, not surprised. The girl had texted the number. The girl had said, "I'm not expendable and I know what it means and I'm still telling you what I'm going to do." The girl had been exactly this all along. She just needed the circumstances to find out. Evelyn Vale looked at the dark motel and let it be what it was. The place where everything had started. The specific, ugly, ordinary place where the rest of her life had begun. And felt no need to make it into something larger than that. It was enough. Damien's hand found hers in the dark. She let it. They stood there a moment longer in the mild spring air, the city moving and breathing around them in its continuous, indifferent way, the lake invisible beyond the buildings but present in the smell of the wind, the distant lights of the skyline reflected in the low clouds above. Then she turned toward the car. He walked beside her. The parking lot crunched under their feet, and the night was quiet in the specific way of a story that has found its ending. Not silence, not absence, but the particular quality of sound when everything that needed to be said has been said, and what remains is just the ordinary, irreplaceable weight of two people moving through the world together, in the direction of whatever came next. Which was not safety, exactly. Not simple, and not without cost, but real. And hers.